all over the country in the 60s, there was an attitude that old was bad. It was make freeways, put freeways through, make new buildings. Charles Hall Page, whose name is famous to us all, and his friend Harry Miller had started San Francisco Heritage because they were concerned that no one was being an advocate for the historic look of San Francisco, the historic urban design patterns, the historic buildings of San Francisco.
San Francisco Heritage began on a park bench with two people talking about the wholesale destruction of the urban renewal plan to remove all of the Victorians, which at the time were considered junk, and realizing that this is wrong, that something very valuable to the culture and history of San Francisco was being lost, and something needed to be done to try and call attention to that.
It wasn't right for a number of reasons. One, of course, was the housing stock. The other was the sort of Victorian design and architecture. Another was that this was a community of the people who lived in these houses.
There was a very broad and active historic preservation effort nationally, particularly in urban areas around the country. And that, I think, was an encouragement and support for organizations like Heritage.
I think Charlie wanted to do a San Francisco version of Charleston, Savannah, etc. And those organizations had been around for a really long time, 50 years, maybe more. They were well established in their communities.
The redevelopment era emerged in the 1950s and 60s across the country. It was an effort to clear urban blight from our cities. And in many ways, the preservation movement is a direct response to the demolition of historic neighborhoods that occurred during that redevelopment push. San Francisco Heritage was founded in 1971 after redevelopment plans in San Francisco called for the demolition of large swaths of neighborhoods such as the Western Addition that displaced primarily African American residents, also demolished many very significant Victorian homes and neighborhoods in that era.
Certain of the oldest and least powerful properties were slated for demolition, despite the fact that they held very important buildings in terms of examples of Victorian housing.
Heritage convinced redevelopment agency that we should move those Victorians because they were each one architecturally significant.
They were moved to south of Geary and about Divisadero.
You have to do this at night because there can't be any traffic. And Victorians are tall, and even if you try to pick streets that don't have any overhead wires, you're never going to find a whole path that will be. So you have to pay the city and others to come and take the overhead wires down, let the building get through that block. The wires in the next block are down. These go back up. And this just the moving truck goes pretty slowly too. I mean, it's not zipping along.
That was all done one night in a very cold evening. We drank a lot of rum that night, or brandy actually.
Oh, it was very fun. It was very cold, but it was very fun. Some of the redevelopment agency staff brought coffee and people brought snacks. And the whole preservation community turned out.
The 1960s were a watershed moment, and from the standpoint of preservation, the National Historic Preservation Act was created in 1966, and this set in motion people's rethinking of preservation ideals. People were thinking in terms of what do we have and what is valuable.
As the city grew, its residential architecture took distinctive forms, and in older sections, blocks of apartments like these are still common.
A group of architectural historians had decided that San Francisco needed to have an architectural study done of it. And they decided to go to the Junior League because the Junior League had ladies who had to do volunteer work and who were probably pretty well educated. So they thought that was a good place to start.
Mrs. Gigi Platt and her Junior League members had seen that the city was vulnerable. And so they did an amazing forethoughted study called Here Today, and they identified important structures which they also felt might be vulnerable. It started to elevate the awareness of the resource that we had.
Heritage was a fledgling organization in 1971 and was sharing space with the National Trust for Historic Preservation. About 9 people in its one-person office.
The Haas Lilienthal family, their heirs, had a house which they loved and I think were quite torn by the prospect of turning it over to the market. They wanted to, of course, retain the integrity of the property.
In 1973, the Haas Lilienthal family, the descendants, gave the house to San Francisco Heritage. In addition to having their offices at the top floor, Heritage opened the lower 2 floors as a house museum.
What it really did was to give Heritage a home, for people to think of it as this represents the organization.
San Francisco Architectural Heritage, by owning the house, had a focal point. It had a place that it could invite people for house tours. It could have lectures in the ballroom. You could rent it out for an evening party. And I just think it's wonderful.
In the early 1975, the biggest changes that were taking place were in the downtown and the financial district.
This was a period of considerable prosperity in this area, and the downtown was under assault. There was demand for space, there was speculation, there was tremendous pressure on the existing stock of commercial buildings. And the developers were very intent on scraping off the building and replacing it with something.
One of the early projects included the efforts to save the several historic buildings downtown, the Alaska Commercial Building, the City of Paris, and the building where Saks Fifth Avenue is.
The county planning department had issued a permit for the demolition of this Alaska Commercial Building. That was my first sort of public appearance, if you will, was to argue for the importance and historical value of that building. It was unsuccessful, as were virtually all of our efforts to stop the removal of historic downtown buildings.
Those kinds of projects made us realize that we were just fighting one argument at a time, one potential demolition at a time.
The ability to compete with a commercial real estate market was simply not realistic. So I think the organization's mission became advocacy and education.
We needed to have a coherent way to deal with all of this. We needed there to be a survey of historic buildings.
Splendid Survivors is the title of the book that resulted from that. That also was a first for the nation. in terms of objectifying evaluations of buildings. And Heritage was a pioneer in developing that tool.
The city basically accepted the results of the San Francisco Heritage Survey and codified them. They ranked historic buildings downtown. They established historic districts of significant clusters of historic buildings.
It really was the project that the city needed in order to have those buildings be with us even today. So I really think that that was the most important thing that Heritage did.
When we bought the Cadillac in '76, there were only 30 rooms that were occupied by anyone, and they were in very bad shape. A lot of the rooms had broken windows. The entire building had been stripped of all the brass fixtures, so all the light fixtures, the sconces had been taken out and sold. We wanted to try to bring it back up to code, and we wanted to create an environment where people could feel they were at home. So we reached out to Heritage, and that's how I met Arnie Lerner.
When I came to the Cadillac, I was very familiar with preserving housing in a place where low-income people had lived. So that seemed the right thing to do and an important thing to do. One of the things I learned when I came here that kind of stuck with me was people who were working here were telling me stories of elderly people who lived in the neighborhood, and when they had to move or were evicted, died within 2-3 weeks of having left, and which impressed upon me even more the importance of staying in your community and how important that was just for their health, not only for just providing them housing, but for preserving that community.
You have to understand that the Tenderloin has a tremendous stigma against it. We have 88 people in this hotel who were homeless for 15 years who now have a home. And now it's part of the National Historic District. And that was done based on Heritage's work initially. They gave us expertise. They told us what we should do, who we should see, where we should go to do this restoration.
Heritage had what I thought was a brilliant idea about preservation, which was that for preservation to be successful, you needed to form alliances within the community to be able to have any kind of effect politically.
By helping us create a historic district, you've created an environment where people felt some pride, some dignity in being involved.
Heritage continues to provide motivation for people to preserve not just the architecture of their community, but those things that give it value and importance. Buildings are invested with memory, and it's that collective memory that builds and binds communities together.
Over the past decade, there has been a growing desire in San Francisco communities to preserve not only the city's architectural heritage, but the living history that's embodied in our legacy businesses, our festivals, events, traditions, all these things that really contribute to the city's cultural heritage.
As a city, our landmarks are very much associated either with high architecture or mostly the history of white communities in San Francisco. So there's been a movement within the field of preservation to bring in new stories, bring in new people.
I think that the attempt to reach a larger constituency in the city is a major change since I worked at Heritage, and one that had to happen.
Is historic preservation about just saving buildings? Is it about preserving beautiful architecture? That's what we've been so good at doing over our past 50 years. But the conversation really was changing.
We often talk about tangible heritage and intangible heritage. Tangible heritage would refer to elements of the built environment, like historic buildings, parks. When we talk about intangible heritage, we're talking about elements of our culture.
Intangible cultural heritage includes non-physical characteristics like customs and traditions,
dance, music,
languages and artistic expressions, and even cuisine.
And so over recent years, we've started to look at, are we saving the spaces in which intangible heritage can happen?
This is the heart of the mission. Specifically, we are standing in Balmy Alley, and this alley is important because the muralist movement began here. It tells the story of the fights that the community has had to endure to survive. We have 1 or 2 murals that are from the 60s, but yearly we are renovating, we are adding, we are removing and putting back on because time changes, and it's important for us to continue the narrative as time changes.
Starting around 2010, with the influx of tech companies into San Francisco, we saw dramatic rises in rent that were displacing some of the cultural anchors in our communities. But we as a preservation organization lacked the tools to protect them.
So for a long time, community organizers here in the Mission and also in cultural communities across the city were seeking out new preservation strategies and tools.
We started seeing, the sad part of what gentrification can do to a neighborhood, where the common folk, the working class folk that actually lives here could no longer afford.
People that have started businesses and were unable to pass it on to the next generation. These are pieces of living history that were being lost.
And so that's the reason the cultural district was established. And there isn't anything like that in the entire country. This is the first cultural district in the nation, and based on that fact that we went through the process and we prevailed, now in the city of San Francisco there are 8 cultural districts.
This is part of a growing national conversation, and Heritage has led these efforts with, for example, the creation of the Legacy Business Registry to recognize the importance of the living heritage embodied in these historic businesses. They are really the cultural undercurrent of our communities. They are what make our communities living and breathing places that we want to live.
So the Legacy Business Registry helps us in the sense that we will cement businesses that you could not find anywhere else. For example, where to buy your masa for tamales, where to buy your masa for tortillas. There are very many things that you can buy here that you cannot find anywhere else. It is important for us to remember, what was here before me, what was here before my parents.
So if historic buildings are the bones of our city's character, then the cultural communities and the businesses that occupy them really give our city its heart and its soul.
Looking back over 50 years, I think it's probably indisputable that Heritage has made a big difference in how the city looks and the understanding about the value and importance of historic character. The forces of growth and economic interest are extremely powerful. So, a relatively small nonprofit is a David battling Goliath. But that doesn't mean you have to just wipe away and give away everything that's important from the past.
What I find meaningful is when I'm working with people who really want to make sure that their legacy is not lost. That means working with communities, speaking with them, engaging with each different community to understand what elements of their cultural heritage do they want to pass on to the next generation.
We're at the Doolin Larson residence at the corner of Haight and Ashbury, also known as the crossroads of the counterculture. It was the former home of Norman Larson, a longtime supporter of San Francisco heritage. He left the property to the organization to create a cultural destination at this site that not only preserves its architecture, but celebrates its incredible counterculture legacy through traditions, through performances, through art. There's an artist in residency program that launched in 2020. There's often a perception that historic places are static places that don't have vibrancy. Some of the most successful experiments that Heritage has championed over the past decade involved partnerships with arts organizations. They bring entirely new audiences into historic buildings to discover them. So the Doolin Larson building is really an incredible opportunity to extend our commitment to the neighborhoods and to really anchor ourselves in the heart of one of the most historic neighborhoods in San Francisco.
One of the last projects I worked on was the designation of Ingleside Presbyterian Church and the Great Cloud of Witnesses. That neighborhood in the 50s, 60s kind of became an African-American enclave. And so on the interior of the church was a collage mural that was created by the Reverend Roland Gordon. But it's really a tribute to African-American history, community, and culture.
I don't think people were aware of the beauty of these buildings and their importance in terms of the historical landscape of San Francisco without Heritage advocating for it. I really don't. The Tenderloin would have been a redevelopment area. It would have looked like south of Market in no time. And instead, we've preserved some of these legacy buildings that offer housing that's so desperately needed. And it was all because people had foresight. And Heritage had that.
It's really important for Heritage to exist and be there, as an advocate, as a watchdog.
If it wasn't for San Francisco Heritage, I think San Francisco would look like any other city in the country with a lot of new, ugly buildings. I put San Francisco in the category of Boston and New Orleans as the unique three that are very human-scaled and very, very enjoyable to be in because of architecture, because of attitude, and because of pride in our city.
San Francisco Heritage can not only be proud for its work in preserving the historic buildings of our city, but also for its leadership nationally in expanding the historic preservation movement to include legacy businesses and traditions and intangible heritage, and really expanding the role of the preservation movement and its impact on the lives of everyday people.
There will always be a need for a group like San Francisco Heritage to be vigilant and to provide those tools for the community to not only recognize what's important to them, but preserve them for future generations of San Franciscans and the country.